Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We will just wait a few minutes, a few seconds for everyone to get in. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're just waiting a few more seconds for people to come in. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We will begin in just a few seconds. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at the virtual event, Protecting Environmental Human Rights Defenders and Promoting Meaningful Participation in Climate Talks, the Role of National Human Rights Institutions, hosted by the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions in collaboration with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the United Nations Development Program under the framework of the Tripartite Partnership. My name is Rosanna, and I will be your facilitator of today. French, Spanish, and Arabic simultaneous interpretation is available during this session. The feature has already been activated and is available by clicking the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen, where you can select the language that you would like to hear. Before we get started, I have a few technical notes to explain. If you would like to share a statement, please write your name and title into the chat. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box. You can find both these features at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please note that this session is currently streaming live on YouTube and will be recorded for documentation purposes. Let us begin. Please welcome Gallery Chairperson, Ms. Mariam I. Atiya, to the stage to get us started with the opening remarks. Ms. Mariam, the floor is yours.
مرحبا، صباح الخير أصحاب السعادة والمعالي، المشاركون الموقرون، الأصدقاء الأعزاء. أحييكم أطيب تحية وأرحب بكم أجمل ترحيب. يسعدني ويشرفني أن أتواجد معكم اليوم كرئيسة للتحالف العالمي للمؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان. كما يسرني أن أرحب بكم جميعا في ندوة اليوم رفيعة المستوى لمناقشة مسألة بالغة الأهمية، وهي حماية المدافعين عن حقوق الإنسان البيئية ودور المؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان في تعزيز المشاركة الهادفة والشاملة في محادثات المناخ. ويطيب لي أن أعرب لكم عن غبطتي الشديدة بأن نشهد انضمام هذا العدد الكبير من مختلف المنظمات والشركاء والمؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان من جميع أنحاء العالم إلى ندوة الويب التي نعقدها اليوم. وأود أن أتقدم بجزيل شكري وعميق امتناني لبرنامج الأمم المتحدة الإنمائي ومكتب المفوضية السامية لحقوق الإنسان القائمين على استضافة فعالية اليوم على دعمهم الرائع وجهودهم الثمينة في تنظيم ندوة الويب المنعقدة اليوم، وعلى شراكتهم المتواصلة ودعمهم طويل الأمد للمؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان من خلال الشراكة الثلاثية. كما أود أن أشكر المتحدثين المميزين الذين شرفونا بحضورهم هنا اليوم، ويسعدنا أن نتمكن من الاستعانة بخبراتكم العريضة في هذه المناقشة الهامة. ومع اقتراب انطلاق فعاليات الدورة 27 لمؤتمر الأطراف في مصر، فإن اجتماعنا سويا اليوم يمثل فرصة مهمة لنا جميعا، وقد جاءت في وقتها تماما. إن تغيير المناخ أصبح بمثابة تهديد ملح على حياة البشر وعلى التمتع بشكل كامل بحقوق الإنسان الأساسية، الأمر الذي يجعله على قمة أولويات التحالف العالمي للمؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان وأعضائه في مختلف المناطق. على مدار السنوات الأخيرة ركز نظام حقوق الإنسان التابع للأمم المتحدة اهتمامه بشكل متزايد على القضايا المتعلقة بتغيير المناخ والحق في بيئة نظيفة وصحية ومستدامة. وقد نشأت ولاية جديدة كتلك الخاصة بالمتحدثين والأصدقاء الموقرين، السيد إيان فراي المقرر الخاص المعني بتعزيز وحماية حقوق الإنسان في سياق تغيير المناخ، والسيد ميشيل فورست المقرر الخاص المعني بالمدافعين عن البيئة بموجب اتفاقية آرهوز. ولم تمر سوى أسابيع قليلة فقط منذ أن أقر مجلس حقوق الإنسان التابع للأمم المتحدة بدور المؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان فيما يتعلق بالعمل المناخي في قراره 51-31 الذي تم تبنيه في دورته 51 التي اختتمت أعمالها مؤخرا. في الواقع دأبت المؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان على مدار سنوات عديدة وحتى اللحظة على لعب دور محوري في التعامل مع تغيير المناخ وحماية المدافعين عن حقوق الإنسان البيئية في عملهم المعتاد. ونحن هنا اليوم لنستمع معا إلى بعض من خبرات المؤسسات الوطنية وتجاربها وآلياتها مع تسليط الضوء على دورها الهام في معالجة هذا التهديد الملح. ويشمل ذلك إسداء المشورة للدول بشأن الإجراءات المناخية التي تضع حقوق الإنسان في قلب توجهاتها، والتعاون مع المجموعات والأفراد الأكثر عرضة لخطر تضرر حقوقهم في جراء تغيير المناخ، ورصد آثار تغيير المناخ على حقوق الإنسان والإبلاغ عنها، والمشاركة في تحقيق العدالة المناخية ومساءلة المكلفين بالواجب. ففي عام 2020 وخلال مؤتمرنا السنوي حول حقوق الإنسان وتغيير المناخ اعتمدت جميع المؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان من مختلف المناطق بيان نتائج حددت فيه كوكبة مميزة من الإجراءات والأولويات لكيفية تطبيق ولايتها ووظائفها الفريدة من أجل تعزيز آلية مستنيرة لحقوق الإنسان قائمة على المشاركة لمواجهة التغييرات المناخية وإرساء العدالة المناخية. وبفضل العمل الجماعي وتحت مظلة التحالف العالمي نجحت المؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان في جميع أنحاء العالم في تأسيس تجمع المؤسسة الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان المعني بتغيير المناخ، والذي يستضيفه التحالف العالمي كتجمع فريد من نوعه يتيح فرصة ثمينة أمام 33 مؤسسة وطنية لحقوق الإنسان من جميع المناطق الأربع للنقاش والتباحث والتحاور وتبادل المعرفة والخبرات، فضلاً عن تنسيق الإجراءات والأنشطة. ينعقد المؤتمر بالاشتراك مع المؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان في جزر المالديف وسلوفاكيا، ويسعدني أن أرحب بهم معنا هنا اليوم حيث سيديرون الجلسات القادمة في ندوة الويب. إن التحالف العالمي بصفته شبكة عالمية للمؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان يعمل بشكل وثيق مع الشبكات الإقليمية للمؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان والشركاء في الأمم المتحدة والمجتمع المدني، كما يدعم مشاركة المؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان في العمليات الوطنية والإقليمية والدولية لتعزيز نهج قائم على حقوق الإنسان تجاه تغيير المناخ، والذي سيؤدي إلى إجراءات وسياسات مناخية أكثر استدامة وفعالية. وفي إطار جهودنا الرامية لتعزيز الرؤية والمشاركة في محادثات المناخ، تقدمنا مؤخرا بطلب إلى اتفاقية الأمم المتحدة الإطارية بشأن التغيير المناخي للحصول على صفة مراقب حتى يتمكن أعضاؤنا من طرح خبراتهم في مجال حقوق الإنسان في مناقشة تغيير المناخ واتخاذ القرارات. وبدعم من برنامج المتحدة للبيئة طور التحالف العالمي للمؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان إرشادات عملية للمؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان توفر التوجيه لأعضائنا بشأن المشاركة على مستوى منظومة الأمم المتحدة بشأن تغيير المناخ وحقوق الإنسان. وقد وضع التحالف العالمي للمؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان والشبكات الإقليمية للمؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان مع شركاء الأمم المتحدة والمدافعين عن حقوق الإنسان خطة عمل عالمية تهدف إلى دعم حماية وتعزيز المدافعين عن حقوق الإنسان والفضاء المدني، حيث نظر إلى المدافعين عن حقوق الإنسان البيئية والشعوب الأصلية على أنهم المجموعات المعرضة للخطر بشكل خاص. وفي الختام أغتنم هذه الفرصة لأعلن أنه بالبحث في طرق جديدة للتعبير عن مواطن قلقنا قبل الدورة 27 لمؤتمر الأطراف، فقد أطلقنا اليوم رسالة مفتوحة إلى الدول الأطراف في اتفاقية الأمم المتحدة الإطارية بشأن تغيير المناخ واتفاقية باريس تدعوهم إلى تعزيز العمل المناخي بما يتماشى مع التزاماتهم تجاه حقوق الإنسان أثناء وبعد المناقشة الحاسمة خلال الدورة 27 لمؤتمر الأطراف والمؤتمر الرابع لاجتماع الأطراف في اتفاق باريس. أدعوكم جميعا لمشاركة رسالتنا مع جهات الاتصال الخاصة بكم وممثلي حكوماتكم لزيادة وصولنا إلى أقصى حد. أتطلع إلى آرائكم الثمينة اليوم ومعرفة المزيد عن عمل المؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان في جميع أنحاء العالم بشأن تغيير المناخ، وأنه لمن دواعي سروري أن أقدم لكم عرض فيديو قصير عن عمل التحالف العالمي للمؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان بشأن تغيير المناخ. أود أن أقدم الآن بيان فيديو من السيدة أساكو أوكاي، الأمين العام المساعد ومدير مكتب الأزمات ببرنامج الأمم المتحدة الإنمائي، لعرض الفيديو، فلتتفضل.
That means taking care of the water, the air, the land, and the animals. We believe in climate justice and making sure that no one is left behind.
NHRIs can help promote much more effective, informed, and participatory climate action. Action that can both benefit people's rights and preserve our environment.
You are that voice advocating for human rights, for climate justice, and for international and intergenerational equity. You are the agents of change.
En nuestros esfuerzos por responder al cambio climático, los derechos humanos deben estar en el centro de esos esfuerzos, si queremos que nuestras comunidades sean fuertes, resistentes e inclusivas.
It's critically important to gather information about the impacts that climate change is having at the national level, impacts which are being felt in every country in the world.
Y por eso son tan importantes las instituciones nacionales de derechos humanos.
We monitor the impact of climate change on our people and our communities generally. And when we do our monitoring activities, we produce reports, and these reports are shared with government and other key stakeholders. And so we advise government to use the right-based approach. They have to involve the people, into decision making. So there should be a synergy between government and the people.
وسيواصل التحالف العالمي للمؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان المشاركة في هذه العملية المهمة مع مجلس حقوق الإنسان وغيره من هيئات الأمم المتحدة وجميع أصحاب المصالح على معالجة تغيير المناخ وقضايا البيئة من أجل حماية وتعزيز حقوق الأجيال الحالية والمقبلة. بعد الاستماع إلى ملاحظة السيدة أوكاي، أغتنم هذه الفرصة لأشكر مرة أخرى زملائنا في برنامج الأمم المتحدة الإنمائي على دعمهم المستمر وشراكتهم. سنستمع الآن إلى السيد فلادلين ستيفانوف، رئيس قسم المؤسسات الوطنية والآليات الإقليمية في المفوضية السامية لحقوق الإنسان. فليتفضل السيد. السيد فلادلين، الكلمة لك.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm delighted to be here today to open this symposium on the role of national human rights institutions in protecting environmental human rights defenders and promoting meaningful participation in climate talks. First, I would like to extend special greetings to the co-hosts of this event, Mrs. Mariam Al-Attiyah, Ganri Chairperson and Chairperson of National Commission for Human Rights of Qatar, and Mrs. Asako Okai, Assistant Secretary General and Director of the Crisis Bureau of UNDP, to the distinguished panelists and to all participants, a very, very warm welcome. This topic and its timing could not be more appropriate. Indeed, over 1 year, both the Human Rights Council and the United Nations General Assembly adopted resolutions recognizing the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. These resolutions acknowledge the ever-present reality for all of us. The air we breathe, the food we eat, the water we drink, and ultimately our health, well-being, and survival all depend on a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. In his call to action for human rights, launched in February 2020, the Secretary General identified climate change as the biggest threat to our survival. He set out the need for ambitious action to protect the rights of future generations, advance the effective implementation of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and ensure climate justice for all. Acting on Secretary General's transformative agenda, it's urgent. Climate change-related disasters, including hurricanes, floods, droughts, and wildfires, continue to have substantial negative impacts on the human rights of millions of people. Most notably, climate change is increasingly and disproportionately affecting those population groups that are already marginalized and vulnerable. For many, climate change is no longer an abstract threat. It is a lived reality that violates their rights. The recognition of a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment and the human right for all brings new momentum to the global call for effective rights-based environmental action that benefits people and the planet itself. On the eve of the COP27, High Commissioner for Human Rights Volker Turk issued today an open letter calling for human rights to be at the heart of efforts to tackle climate change. In his letter, he warned that our right to life is being threatened by insufficient action in the face of a climate emergency. The outcome of COP27 is critical for people's effective enjoyment of human rights around the world, not just in years to come, but now. The High Commissioner warned in his letter that many parts of the world will be uninhabitable within our children's lifetimes, with unimaginable consequences. People are losing their homes, their livelihoods, and their lives. Indeed, we need higher ambition, stronger international cooperation, and increased climate finance and participation. The design, implementation, and monitoring of climate action must include the meaningful participation of all stakeholders, including national human rights institutions. This is because as state bodies mandated with the promotion and protection of human rights at the country level, national human rights institutions are in a good position to promote transformative rights-based climate action, to support communities and preserve the environment. As a matter of fact, the recently adopted Human Rights Council resolution on national human rights institutions highlights their role in addressing the human rights implications of climate change. National human rights institutions can see and identify how the adverse effects of climate change, including sudden and slow onset disasters, directly or indirectly affect the full and effective enjoyment of human rights. National human rights institutions can also promote climate justice by assisting victims to seek justice and redress, advising states on human rights-centered climate action, and ensuring the decisions on climate change are participatory, non-discriminatory, and accountable, with the benefits and burdens of climate action shared equitably National human rights institutions can also take steps to support the protection of environmental human rights defenders, the topic of today's meeting, who face abuse, threats, and harassment for their work addressing the triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and nature loss of a daily basis. Effective climate action depends on all people being able to exercise their rights to a meaningful and informed public participation, including through freedom of speech and assembly. Through the Tripartite Partnership, the Global Alliance of NHRIs, UNDP, and OHCHR have an important role to play in supporting right holders in the exercise of their rights and advancing rights-based climate action. For this reason, I would like to express our eagerness and readiness to continue to establish and strengthen national human rights institutions worldwide. This includes enhancing their engagement with international human rights mechanisms and processes, including the Conference of the Parties. Climate action must be undertaken at all levels and by all actors in society. It is only through enhanced cooperation and meaningful partnership that we can mainstream human rights concerns into policymaking and legislation addressing climate change. We can work together and improve monitoring and accountability for the human rights impact of the environmental damage. This symposium represents an important opportunity to share ideas for our collective work going forward. Therefore, I would like to encourage you to share your experiences and best practices in addressing climate change, including through the protection of environmental human rights defenders and the promotion of meaningful participation in climate talks. Thank you very much for your attention.
شكرا لك سيد فلادلين على ملاحظتك الهامة، وشكرا للمفوضية السامية لحقوق الإنسان على الدعم الطويل الأمد للمؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان والتعاون مع التحالف العالمي للمؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان. أود أن أعطي الكلمة الآن للسيد أحمد أدهم عبد الله، المنظم المساعد للتجمع المعني بتغيير المناخ التابع للتحالف العالمي للمؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان، الذي سيقدم الجلسة الأولى اليوم. واسمحوا لي أن أجدد ترحيبي بكم جميعا.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Welcome to the Symposium on Protecting Environmental Human Rights Defenders and Promoting Meaningful Participation in Climate Talks. I am a co-convener of the GANRI Caucus on Human Rights and Climate Change. The caucus consists of 33 member states across 4 regions. Distinguished delegates, it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome all delegates to the first panel discussion of the symposium. Indeed, environmental human rights defenders face abuse, threats, and harassment for their work addressing the triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and nature loss. Session 1 will focus on the legal protection and assistance to environmental human rights defenders and the roles of NHRIs as promoters of human rights-based approach in climate action. We will also look into experiences by NHRIs in the promotion of freedom of expression and assembly. I invite participants to post questions in the Q&A box on your Zoom portal, and we will address the questions during the time allocated for Q&A after the interventions by distinguished panelists. We have 4 distinguished speakers in this panel discussion, and the first intervention is by the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change, Dr. Ian Fry, by a pre-recorded video statement. Without further ado,
so sorry to interrupt, Adam. Yes, very sorry to interrupt. We do have a video from Ms. Asako Okai from UNDP that we would like to share with participants before we get started with the first session. So sorry about the interruption. And please let's put that video up before we get started with the first session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Distinguished delegates, Ganli Chair, UN partners, national human rights institutions, colleagues, I am pleased to participate in the opening of this symposium hosted by the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions in collaboration with the UN Human Rights Office and the United Nations Development Programme. This collaboration is within the framework of the tripartite partnerships to support national human rights institutions, which is a means and a way for us to work collectively to prioritize the work of national human rights institutions. We want to support them as they continue to work on the front lines of contemporary human rights and development challenges around the world. The triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity and ecosystem degradation threatens to reverse decades of development and exacerbate poverty. It disproportionately affects the most vulnerable, marginalized, and excluded people and communities, and act as a threat multiplier, amplifying conflicts, tensions, and structural inequalities. This crisis is considered the greatest threat to human rights of our time that contribute to and exacerbates environmental injustices everywhere. An inclusive and rights-based approach to climate action is needed to ensure that no one is left behind and to usher in social and economic transformation to advance an inclusive green recovery and accelerate progress on the 2030 Agenda. The Human Rights Council recognized the human rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment in October 2021. Following this, in a landmark move on 28 July, the United Nations General Assembly recognized that a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a universal human right. This important international legal development reinforces action in over 150 countries where the right to a healthy environment is already recognized. It reinforces the rights dimension of the climate crisis and its impact. The resolution has the potential to bring real change that benefits people and calls upon state, international organizations, and private actors to scale up their efforts to achieve sustainable environmentally conscious development. National human rights institutions and Gandhi have been at the forefront of efforts to highlight the human rights dimensions and impact of the climate crisis. This is acknowledged by the actions of the UN Human Rights Council just 3 weeks ago, which adopted a resolution welcoming the critical contributions of national human rights institutions in monitoring, reporting, and advising governments and other stakeholders on climate action that is based on human rights. We applaud the specific recognition of the role of national human rights institutions by the Human Rights Council and the work of NHRIs and Gandhi and the regional networks in these efforts. We are proud to partner with you and support you in these efforts. Around the world, UNDP plays an important role in the fight against climate change and environmental degradation and its human rights implications. UNDP's broad-based development mandate, global presence, and expertise across a range of cross-cutting areas and issues related to human rights and the environment uniquely position UNDP in the UN system and with partners and stakeholders to support the realization of the right to a healthy environment for all. We support policymakers, governments, national human rights institutions, and stakeholders at all levels to ensure that climate change adaptation and mitigation policies and measures are effectively grounded in a human rights-based approach that put people's rights at the center. This work includes strengthening legal frameworks and ensuring inclusive processes, including through UNDP's Climate Promise. Through this flagship initiative, 110,000 people have been engaged in stakeholder consultations on nationally determined contributions in 67 countries, helping to gild social consensus and explicit recognition of the roles of youth and women's leadership in renewed climate pledges. A clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a matter of justice. It calls for expanded opportunities for advocacy, legal claims, strategic litigation, and ultimately greater accountability of states and other actors, including businesses, for their actions toward our environment. Within this context, the role of environmental human rights defenders who have already paid a high prices for their calls and actions to stop harmful practices is critical. In 2020, 227 environmental activists were murdered, the highest number recorded for a second consecutive year. Colleagues, we all depend on the environment for our direct and indirect well-being. So threats to it are threats to human rights, to peace, security, and sustainable development. UNDP and the broader UN system is committed to supporting governments, national human rights institutions, civil society, businesses, and people in their effort to make the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment a reality for all. The time for action is now. We have no time to lose. I thank you and look forward to learning about the conclusions of the discussions today.
بعد الاستماع إلى ملاحظات السيدة أوكاي، أغتنم هذه الفرصة لأشكر مرة أخرى زملائنا في برنامج الأمم المتحدة الإنمائي على دعمهم المستمر وشراكاتهم. ونعود مرة أخرى للسيد أحمد أدهم عبد الله، فليتفضل. سيد أحمد فلتتفضل.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Welcome to the first panel discussion. We have 4 distinguished speakers in this first panel, and the first intervention is by the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change, Dr. Ian Fry, by a pre-recorded video statement. Without further ado, I humbly request our technical team to play Dr. Fry's statement. Thank you.
I want to first thank the organisers, NHRI, OHCHR and UNDP for inviting me to participate in this high-level symposium. I regret that I'm not able to participate in person, as I'll be travelling to Egypt to attend the climate change COP. In my report to the UN General Assembly as Special Rapporteur for the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change, given just over a week ago, I highlighted the plight of environmental rights defenders. I noted that as groups and communities are becoming increasingly frustrated with a lack of action on climate change and the subsequent loss and damage that has occurred, and it will occur into the future. This frustration has led to protests and public interventions bearing witness to the climate emergency. Protests and other forms of interventions have precipitated reprisals from governments and businesses supporting the fossil fuel industry. Some climate rights defenders have been killed. In one country in Latin America, for instance, a government has been accused of criminalising popular leaders and social movements that dare to question the socio-environmental impacts of climate change and large mitigation projects in the region. In the Philippines, the passing of legislation on anti-terrorism endangered the lives of climate justice advocates. Further, civil society organisations are being red tagged and vilified, and human rights advocates have been imprisoned based on false charges, and some have been murdered. In the United States, at least one environmental organisation has been labelled by a national enforcement agency as a domestic terrorism threat. Trade unions' campaigns on climate change and its impact on workers have been targeted in various countries. Indigenous peoples defending their rights have been the target of serious attacks and human rights abuses. In 2020, there was a total of 227 lethal attacks. A disproportionate 5 out of 7 mass killings recorded in 2020 were of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous women acting as environmental defenders face additional obstacles to their well-being, such as sexual violence, sexual discrimination, harassment of their children and families, and increased vulnerability to mistreatment from state forces and armed groups. Concerns have also been expressed to me that climate change activists may be targeted for recrimination and harassment if they are involved in protests during COP27 in Egypt. I am particularly concerned about the safety of activists based in Egypt and have written to the Egyptian government seeking assurance that activists will not be targeted. A recent report by Global Witness documents that 200 land and environmental defenders were killed worldwide in 2021, and that 1,733 have been killed over the past 10 years, 2012 to 2021. In the last few days, an environmental activist was kidnapped in Chad near the Sudanese border. All of this has to stop. In my report to the UN General Assembly, I made 2 recommendations regarding the protection of environmental rights defenders. The first is to mandate the International Law Commission, with a 2-year turnaround time, to develop international legal procedures to give full and effective protection of environmental and Indigenous rights defenders, including establishing an international tribunal for the prosecution of perpetrators of violence and death against environmental and Indigenous rights defenders. The second is to mandate the International Criminal Court to include in the definition of ecocide actions against environmental and Indigenous human rights defenders. I hope you can give considerations to these recommendations and help me explore ways of advancing them further. I wish you all the best with your symposium.
The next distinguished speaker is Michel Faust. Mr. Faust was the Secretary General of the French National Commission from 2005 to 2016 and was the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders from 2014 to 2020. He was elected in June 2022 as the first UN Special Rapporteur on environmental defenders. During his mandate on the situation of human rights defenders, Mr. Faust presented a number of thematic reports highlighting the situations suffered by specific groups of defenders. He presented reports on the situation of environmental and land rights defenders, defenders working in the field of business and human rights, on the situation of defenders working for the rights of people on the move, as well as a report on good practices in the protection of human rights defenders. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Michel Faust, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I would like to start by thanking the organizers for their kind invitation to speak at this event about the challenges environmental defenders are facing and also the possible ways to enhance their protection. As my colleague has said, environmental defenders play a very important role for our environment by advocating for increased environmental protection, by challenging destructive practices, but also exposing environmental crimes. And their role is becoming increasingly important as our planet becomes more and more polluted and contaminated, and as the climate crisis intensifies and continues to ravage the world year after year. But yet, those who are on the front line of defending our planet are severely at risk, and the statistics are really worrying. The recent report by Global Witness has been tracking killings of defenders since 2012, and the recent report shows that 200 land and environmental defenders were killed in 2021, nearly 4 people a week. And this is probably only the tip of the iceberg. Impunity of the perpetrators of these crimes and lack of effective protection constitute a major challenge in ensuring an adequate protection to environmental defenders. And the alarming situation has been, of course, exacerbated by the refugee crisis in Europe, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the ongoing war in Ukraine. On every continent, environmental defenders are in danger. And the majority of the attacks take place in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia, but also other areas of the world, including Europe, are not spared. I've been also informed that dozens of climate activists and environmental defenders have been prevented to participate in the next COP27. The government of Egypt would have refused to issue visa. That's, for me, not acceptable. States must take immediate action to reverse this worrying trend. This may be done through greater recognition of the role environmental defenders play, deeper understanding of the challenges they face, but also enhanced protection and empowerment. The Aarhus Convention on Access to Information, Public Participation in Decision-Making, and Access to Justice in Environmental Matters, which will be presented to you today, is for me a powerful international instrument, binding instrument, imposing on its 46 parties across Europe and Central Asia an obligation to protect environmental defenders. And this is why, probably alarmed by the serious situation faced by environmental defenders, the meeting of the parties to the Aarhus Convention have established a new rapid response mechanism in the form of a special rapporteur to ensure an effective response to environmental defenders in danger. And this is the first mechanism in the world specifically protecting environmental defenders to be established within a legally binding framework, either under the UN or other intergovernmental system. And in June this year, I've been elected by consensus by the member states as the first special rapporteur on environmental defenders. I'm honored, of course, to have been entrusted with this important task of providing immediate protection to environmental defenders. The violations that may be brought to my attention are not only those resulting from actions or inaction of public authorities, but also from private entities like companies and individuals. And I will promptly act upon receiving a complaint from any member of the public, a party of the Secretariat, that a defender is experiencing threats. And for the purpose of my mandate, an environmental defender is any person, any organization that seeks to have access to information, to participate in decision-making, or to have access to justice regarding the environment. And this is not limited only to persons who would identify themselves as environmental defenders, but also local communities, journalists, lawyers, indigenous people, and anyone else seeking to protect the environment. And as the mandate has also an extra territorial scope, I will also have the power to intervene when transnational companies who have their seat in one of the state parties to the convention would threaten environmental defenders in Africa, Asia, Europe, or the Americas through their subsidiaries, through their contractors. For instance, when defenders in Latin America would be threatened by a Spanish company, or when defenders in Uganda would be persecuted by the French company. And in order to fulfill my mandate, I will have at my disposal a range of tools that will allow me to act quickly and effectively within the limits of the mandate. This would include issuing protection measures, including relocation, directing the parties concerned to refrain from any action that may amount to persecution, penalization, or harassment, or to act without delay to protect complainants or any other person from these violations. Protection measures will be flexible and adapted to the specific needs of defenders. And to this end, I will tailor the content of each protection measure to the particular situation, taking into account the nature of the alleged persecution. Other avenues I have at my disposal will include issuing diplomatic channels with countries, visiting countries, issuing public statements or press releases, and publishing them through the media or social media, or bringing the matter before the concerned governments and health states. Cooperation with other human rights bodies, including other rapporteurs, national human institutions, is for me of importance. And in order to coordinate and strengthen joint efforts, whether necessary, I will inform them about violations brought to my attention. Raising awareness is also a key part of my mandate to ensure greater recognition of the role environmental defenders are playing in the safeguard of our common environment, but also to understand the challenge they face in each country, especially in this time of multiple crises, but also to stress the need and urgency to end any forms of penalization, persecution, or harassment. International events, meetings of convention bodies, country visits will provide an opportunity for me to raise awareness on these matters and to remind the governments of the obligations to protect environmental defenders. I would like to conclude by informing you that on November 23, I will hold an open online meeting for RS Party's national focal points and any interested stakeholders. At the meeting, I will present my vision and plans for the mandate and outline the approach and priorities of my work. The meeting is open to any person who would like to register their interest with the RS Secretary to take part. And I hope that I will be able to demonstrate the usefulness of this important new mechanism to protect those whose lives are at risk for defending our environment and to ensure that they may exercise their rights granted them by the Convention without fear. And believe me, to conclude, the SDGs are doomed to fail if we are not able to protect those who protect our planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for your excellent intervention, and congratulations on your new appointment. The next speaker is Mr. Kunan Jagal Saihan, the Chief Commissioner of the National Human Rights Commission of Mongolia. Mr. Jagal Saihan specializes in human rights and judiciary and began his career in 2002. He holds a master's degree in law from the Eötvös Loránd University of Science in Hungary. Sir, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon to everyone, and I'm very delighted to be part of this important symposium and on a very important issue of climate change and environment protection. Like elsewhere, everywhere else, Mongolia, we have struggled also with combating negative impacts of climate change, and also with the environment protection issue. I have prepared a presentation. It is pretty detailed, and I think that you can get access through the organizers. And as we have a very short of time, I will be trying to emphasize very main points of the protection mechanism of Mongolia of the human rights defenders. Mongolia is one of the first, well, it's the first country in Asia Pacific region that has adopted the law on legal status of human rights defenders, which means that a legal environment to protect human rights defenders, including environmental human rights defenders. So the Parliament of Mongolia last year on 2nd of April has adopted this legislation enabling the overall mechanism, national mechanism for the protection of human rights defenders. And also this was as a result of joint efforts by the UN, by UN Special Rapporteur and other international organizations. And here I must say that Mr. Michel Forst, when he was Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, visited Mongolia, in fact, and also promoted this initiative to establish a mechanism for human rights defenders. Thank you, Michel Forst. And now that we have national human rights mechanism on the protection of human rights defenders within the National Human Rights Commission of Mongolia, we have appointed a commissioner specifically responsible for issues related to protection of human rights defenders. And there will be a human rights defenders committee which will do assessment, risk assessment of human rights defenders and the overall situation and possible threats to them, and will bring the conclusion. And based on that, the commissioner in charge of human rights defenders will take necessary actions. So in Mongolia, we do have challenges related to environment protection. And this is, I must say that is also pretty much related to overall geographical location of Mongolia and also the overall livelihood of Mongolians. Because Mongolia is a country which covers, which in terms of the territory, it's 18th biggest country in terms of the territory in the world. And then the population is pretty small, so 3.4 million population who live in this big on this big territory. And also in terms of the diversity, Mongolian land is consisting of different types of regions, like, for example, desert region would cover 19.1% of the territory, desert steppe region 23.4%. And so this is also we see that one of the impacts, and the number of these regions is increasing, the percentage of this number, because of the climate change. And as a result, we can see that many internal migration and displacement and unemployment, and also we see the vulnerability because of this harsh winters, because of this desert storms. And plus to this, we also have the Mongolian country. Mongolia is pretty much dependent on the mining sector, which results also in damaging environment in a greater amount. And because of that, especially the local people, those who still live in a traditional nomadic way of life, they have protest this mining industry, big mining projects, and there's a conflict between the locals and also with the multinational companies, and we consider them as the human rights defenders. And Mongolia also have a really bad experience of losing environmental human rights defender back in 2016. So there was a young man who fought for the wildlife, for preserving the wildlife, for protecting the environment, and he was well, people say, and we consider that he was killed, and he was a human rights environmental human rights defender. So based on these issues, it was really important to have established a national human rights defenders mechanism, and this happened in 2021. So during this work of protecting human rights defenders, what we see is that there is a big lack of cooperation from the government institutions with the human rights defenders, and basically they wouldn't get the information they would need, and also they wouldn't have a proper response from the government side, and also they would miss the protection from the government, from the police, and a proper assistance from the government administrative authorities. And the Commission, what we have done so far is that we have conducted several field visits, especially with regard to the big projects in a mining sector, and also big projects related to the national development, like hydro plant projects. And then we also have received and have assisted environmental human rights defender in personality of Ms. Suhkarel, and probably also some of you might know, because she's one of the active environmental human rights defenders, and who was accused of conflicting with the national interest, just only for asking the human rights impact assessment of the Erden Bolgan hydro plant. And this is the reality, and in a reality this is happening, and the Commission is at the moment working and assisting her, and also at the same time we are doing the document assessment, evaluation of the different documents related to pollution of the environment, related to big projects. And what we see is that often okay. So what we see is that often these projects, especially government-funded projects, do not comply with the legislations related to environment protection. And also often people are excluded in decision-making. Often this kind of projects do not do the consultation with the local people, with native people. And often the reality is that people getting affected by these projects, by this mining or hydro projects, are not aware of where they will be where they will be moved, or how they will be compensated, and how other human rights will be ensured during the project and also after the project. And Also, another thing that the Human Rights Commission of Mongolia is doing, besides its...
Kunan, you just have 30 seconds to finish up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And what we have done so far in order to raise awareness on environment protection is that we have Human Rights Forum, which is organized annually under the auspices of the president. And last year we have a theme on climate change and environment protection and its impact on human rights. And also, and as a result, we have issued recommendations for the parliament and also for the government on how to protect the environment and how to protect human rights and freedoms during the and afterwards of the impacts of the climate change, and also after the big projects, big mining projects and development projects. So it is important that the national human rights institutions would have a leadership role and also promote it and also disseminate the importance of protecting environment and protecting human rights defenders that work in environment protection. And also one good thing is that, that the important thing is that the National Human Rights Institution should have a mandate to force the government authorities to provide a proper protection for the environmental human rights defenders. As in our situation, the mandate of Human Rights Commissioner is that once Human Rights Commissioner issues a recommendation or a demand, then it should be fulfilled by the authority or by the government official that receives it. So the mandate is a pretty strong, and then it's very important to have very active leadership by the National Human Rights Institution. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kunan. The last panelist for this session is Mr. Munir Ben Salah, Secretary General of the National Human Rights Council of Morocco. Mr. Ben Salah is actively engaged in advocacy and promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms, both in Morocco and at the international level. He has over 17 years of experience and held several positions within the Morocco Organization of Human Rights. Distinguished delegates, Mr. Munir Ben Salah, for you. The floor is yours.
Merci, monsieur le modérateur. Mesdames et messieurs, tout protocole observé, c'est avec réel plaisir de prendre part aujourd'hui à cet événement qui intervient en prélude de la COP27. Et je tiens à remercier l'ensemble des parties ayant contribué à son organisation, dont particulièrement le Haut Commissariat des Nations Unies aux droits de l'homme, le Programme des Nations Unies pour le développement et le GANRI. Notre rencontre aujourd'hui est d'une grande importance car elle intervient dans un contexte marqué par des problématiques auxquelles plusieurs pays, particulièrement dans la région méditerranéenne, font face. Une sécheresse, entre autres, qui pose non seulement des menaces à la stabilité des sociétés, mais met à l'épreuve l'ensemble des systèmes nationaux et internationaux de gestion des droits de l'homme. La lutte contre le changement climatique et la concrétisation des objectifs du développement durable sont conditionnés par une implication pleine de toutes les composantes d'une société. Je voudrais rappeler dans ce cadre que le Maroc fait face à des défis posés par les changements climatiques, dont notamment la situation actuelle de stress hydrique, la vulnérabilité de certaines régions, l'érosion, les défis au niveau de la biodiversité, mais également la migration et les déplacements dans la mesure où le changement climatique pourrait provoquer des mouvements migratoires là où les marges d'adaptation des populations seraient épuisées. S'ajoute à cela un autre défi concernant l'harmonisation des législations nationales avec les dispositions de l'accord de Paris et qui devrait être effectué en corrélation avec les objectifs du développement durable, ainsi que les pactes internationaux et les recommandations des Nations Unies en matière des droits de l'homme. Le CNDH, dans l'objectif de moraliser la vie publique, a placé la question de l'éducation aux droits de l'homme parmi les priorités grâce notamment au déploiement de la stratégie 3P, prévention, protection, promotion, qui vise à renforcer la place du citoyen au cœur de toutes les actions. Il est essentiel de rappeler que la question de l'environnement, les droits y afférents sont abordés de manière transversale dans les stratégies du Conseil. La nouvelle stratégie du CNDH place la question des droits environnementaux et du développement durable au cœur de toute action et initiative. Cette stratégie met l'accent sur la dimension environnementale et l'effectivité des droits et souligne que les grandes transformations environnementales enregistrées sur la planète ont montré que la durabilité de toute politique ou action de développement est plus que jamais conditionnée par l'importance qu'elles attachent aux équilibres écologiques. Le CNDH continue de consolider ses actions en matière de mobilisation et de sensibilisation et en renforcement des capacités de la société civile sur des questions du genre, climat et ODD. L'objectif étant de constituer un pôle de compétences et un réseau national de personnes ressources spécialisées, notamment dans les thématiques des changements climatiques et du développement durable. En guise d'illustration, le CNDH a organisé le 30 octobre 2021 une journée d'échange avec des représentants de la jeunesse et des dynamiques marocaines. Cette journée, marquée par la participation du rapporteur spécial sur le climat, M. David Boyd, est couronnée par l'adoption d'une déclaration finale qui met en exergue le rôle central des jeunes dans tout effort de lutte contre les changements climatiques, a eu pour objectif de discuter les derniers développements sur les scènes nationales et internationales, de recueillir les recommandations des jeunes et dynamiques marocaines en matière de suivi des politiques publiques nationales et territoriales et d'évaluation de mise en œuvre des ODD dans leur relation avec la jeunesse. À rappeler aussi que le CNDH avait conclu un partenariat stratégique avec l'UNESCO visant à promouvoir l'éducation aux droits de l'homme. Dans ce cadre, un manuel d'éducation à la citoyenneté et aux droits de l'homme conjointement a été élaboré dans l'objectif d'offrir une nouvelle ressource éducative pour faire progresser l'appropriation de la culture des droits de l'homme, notamment parmi les jeunes. À rappeler également que le CNDH a conclu une convention de coopération et de partenariat avec le ministère de l'Éducation nationale pour la promotion de la culture des droits de l'homme au sein des établissements scolaires, signée en 2013, mise à jour en 2021. Protection des défenseurs des droits de l'homme. La protection des défenseurs des droits de l'homme est un pilier essentiel dans le travail du CNDH. Il leur apporte son soutien et assure notamment le rôle de mécanisme indépendant pour recevoir les plaintes et les informations de leur part sur les violations constatées dans le cadre de leur travail et celles dont ils sont eux-mêmes victimes. Les commissions régionales du CNDH jouent un rôle primordial non seulement en tant que défenseurs en elles-mêmes, mais également en tant que commission chargée de protéger et de promouvoir les droits de l'homme des autres défenseurs. Les CRDH traitent des plaintes, assurent le monitoring des manifestations et la médiation, œuvrant en faveur du renforcement des capacités de la société civile et apportent leur soutien aux associations et aux individus de différentes positions politiques pour participation à des séminaires ou organisations d'événements. Il y a lieu de noter que les organisations de la société civile elles-mêmes, les défenseurs des droits de l'homme, sont des partenaires essentiels du CNDH dans la protection, la promotion des droits de l'homme, la revitalisation de la vie démocratique et la réalisation des objectifs du développement durable. Afin de protéger et de développer efficacement l'espace civique et assurer un environnement sûr aux défenseurs des droits de l'homme, le CNDH travaille sur le renforcement des capacités en matière d'élaboration de plans et de collecte de fonds dans le but de permettre aux femmes défenseuses des droits de l'homme de documenter, de suivre et de traiter ces violations des droits des femmes défenseurs des droits de l'homme. S'agissant des femmes défenseurs des droits de l'homme, le CNDH œuvre en faveur du renforcement des capacités des femmes et au développement de leurs connaissances dans divers domaines, en particulier liés à leur travail et aux systèmes internationaux, aux mécanismes de protection des droits. À titre d'exemple, le CNDH est un partenaire dans l'exécution d'un programme international avec le Canada et Oxfam, ayant notamment pour objectif de renforcer les capacités de gestion d'action et d'organisation des organisations œuvrant dans le domaine de la protection des droits des femmes. Le CNDH a également organisé le mois d'octobre 2019 à Casablanca, en partenariat avec le Haut Commissariat des Nations Unies aux droits de l'homme, un atelier sous le thème « Vers une protection juridique de l'action des défenseurs des droits des femmes ». Exemple d'intervention du CNDH et interaction avec les défenseurs locaux. En 2021, après avoir reçu une plainte de plusieurs associations de la société civile concernant un projet de décharge publique dans la wilaya de Sidi Ben Nour qui a provoqué une protestation des habitants de la région et des agriculteurs, la CRDH Kazakhstan a tenu des réunions avec les autorités concernées et la population locale et a entrepris des visites de terrain. Une délégation de la CRDH a visité le site du projet situé dans une zone agricole. La CRDH a préparé un rapport détaillé qui comprenait des recommandations, ce qui conduit les autorités à suspendre le projet afin de reconsidérer ses conséquences. Par ailleurs, dans ces différents rapports, le CNDH élabore un nombre important de recommandations à même de permettre une protection renforcée des défenseurs des droits, notamment les femmes. À titre d'illustration, en ce qui concerne la liberté d'opinion et d'expression et la liberté de la presse, le CNDH a appelé à amender l'ensemble des dispositions du droit pénal relatives à la thématique de la liberté d'expression, de manière à garantir la conformité avec l'article 19 du Pacte international relatif aux droits civiques et politiques et à faire en sorte que toutes les restrictions imposées à cette liberté soient clairement définies par un texte juridique explicite et disponible et que ces restrictions soient nécessaires pour respecter les droits ou la réputation d'autrui, pour protéger la sécurité nationale, l'ordre public, la santé publique ou la moralité publique. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Mr. Murray, for the excellent presentation. Now we move on to the Q&A session. If you have any specific questions, please feel free to ask in the Q&A chat box. In the meantime, I would like to ask panelist Michelle Forst on what are the existing mechanisms to seek remedy and to compensate for loss and damage for environmental human rights defenders. What are the existing mechanisms?
Of course, there are, as it has been presented, different mechanisms. One of them being the UN special rapporteurs that have a broad mandate on several issues related to environmental defenders. We heard on the special rapporteur on environment and human rights. We heard also on my colleague rapporteur on climate. We have the special rapporteur on freedom of assembly and freedom of expression. That also could intervene in case where defenders were prevented to organize a rally or to protest in the streets or being harassed by governments or by companies. So we have a full range of different possibilities offered by the UN, but also by the regional systems. Not to forget that in Africa, we have a special rapporteur on human rights defenders, same with the Americas, with a special rapporteur, which is attached to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. In the rest of Europe, we have also the broad mandate offered by the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe and OSCE, which was a regional body. So we have different possibilities, and the idea is to work more closely together to make sure that whenever we see that it's more effective, we could do joint actions, while at some occasions we would prefer to do activities on our own. And there is currently some additional proposals offered to the discussion at different sessions of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, where they will be discussed later on. So let's look at how we could use the different tools and mechanisms to make sure that we are able to protect human rights defenders as a whole, but also specifically that are the most at risk currently.
Thank you, Mr. Forst. Do we have any questions from the floor?
Yes, we actually do, Ahmed. We have one question from one of the participants that says, to what extent is some international legal instruments are helping us to protect human rights defenders?
Would any of the panelists would like to respond to that question? It's more relevant to Michael Forst. Would you like to answer that question?
I mean, as I said, yes, there are different legal instruments. As I was trying to explain, this mandate, to which I've been elected in June this year, is the first to be established within a legally binding instrument, meaning that states would have an obligation to respect and to fulfill the main requirements coming from my mandate. And this, later on the panel 2, you will have a good presentation by Yves Lador on the different possibilities offered by the Aarhus Convention, notably the Compliance Committee, which also looks at how states would respect the different provisions offered by the Aarhus Convention.
Okay, we're running out of time for the first panel. Do you have any other questions on the floor? Yeah, Michaela?
Thank you for the floor. I have a question for Mr. Kunan. Maybe I've misheard this information, but was it challenging to gain acceptance and respect and trust from human rights defenders to communicate with you and consider you as an important organization who can provide them support? Thank you.
Well, actually, as I mentioned, that we have adopted the legislation, so law on protection of human rights defenders, and which clearly states what are the obligations of the state party, what are the obligations and powers and rights of the National Human Rights Institution, and specifically the Committee of the Human Rights Defenders. So, and you can see that clearly that how we can help them and what are the rights of the human rights defenders, because as they are stated in the legislation. So, and now that we have established, we see that many complaints are now coming to the commission, to the national mechanism. So, and people now feel more safe that in conducting the environmental protection activities. So I think it is helping, and it is making human rights defenders to feel safer, because now that we have legal protection in place.
Thank you very much. Maybe I would have one further question for you. What are the barriers? And this can be also a question for other panelists as well. What are the barriers you see, you identify, or what would be the next steps to make your work even more efficient? Thank you.
Well, during the drafting of this legislation and during the discussion of establishing this human rights defenders mechanism, I mean national, we had a debate on, especially on funding of the human rights defenders work, because often the government and also other parties like the multinational companies, the big projects, they would think that often human rights defenders, they got paid, they got money from other sources. And what we did is that we put a provision in the legislation that the financing is open, and the only restriction on the financing of this human rights defenders work would be that funds received from the International Intelligence Service, they cover organizations or persons that conduct activities harming the national unity or money laundering, terrorist or extremist activities, and also funds from unknown donors are prohibited. So the funding of the work of the human rights defenders was pretty much a topic of discussion and debate, and also one of the challenging problems, because often the local natives wouldn't have proper funding to continue to fight against the big companies in order to protect the environment. And also it is also can be seen that any mechanism also which is funded by the state organization also can be one of the questionable issues, because usually mostly human rights defenders, the people activists would have doubt in an activity of the government-funded authority. So in our case, it's National Human Rights Commission. So it is one of the challenging problems that we should convince them that we are there to protect the environmental human rights defenders. So I think this is also one of the challenging issues, and we also need to overcome this.
Okay, thank you. We have time to take one additional question. We have a question coming in from the floor. There are strategic lawsuits against public participation in order to silence human rights defenders. So the question is there any initiative at the UN level to protect human rights defenders from such lawsuits as such? Perhaps Michael would answer.
Yes, I mean, just briefly, there has been in the past initiatives taken by the UN. I remember one of the reports prepared by the former Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Assembly, who presented one of the report to the Council with a set of concrete recommendations, and states since then have decided to tackle the topic at different levels. When it comes to the EU, because the question comes from Kosovo, you know that there is currently a recent initiative taken by the EU, a new directive on SLAPs, which is currently under discussion, which will be probably approved, trying to protect and also to prevent the misuse of SLAPs by companies to target journalists, but also mainly environmental defenders and those who are trying to denounce corruption.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Michel Forst, Mr. Kunan Jagos Raihan, and Mr. Munir Ben Salah for your excellent interventions. With that, I conclude session 1, and I'm pleased to hand over the floor to my colleague, Michaela Uhayova, for session 2. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam, for passing me the floor and for the introduction. At the session 2, we'll zoom out a bit from the perspective of human rights defenders, their local work and international cooperation, to a broader picture of participation of civic society in environmental matters and climate action. Participation at political decisions stems from the basic political human rights. Above all, participation of civic society at specifically environmental issues, including climate action, is as a set of rights protected and defined by several agreements. For example, Article 12 of the Paris Agreement states, parties shall cooperate in taking measures as appropriate to enhance climate change education, training, public awareness, and public participation and public access to information, recognizing the importance of steps with respect to enhancing actions under this agreement. This is where we start our discussion from. To help us direct our thoughts and discussion, we suggest 3 questions for the session 2. You should be able to see them in the chat box as well. I'll just go quickly through 3 questions, which we can come back later on during Q&A session or part of our session. First of all, we would like to identify challenges or barriers for the meaningful participation of NHRIs and CSOs in climate action, and how can these barriers draw on procedural human rights to overcome these barriers. What strategies, as a second question, what strategies of NHRIs or CSOs has been proven efficient or potentially leading to success? And the last question, what strategic priorities in support of meaningful public participation should NHRIs focus on in their collaboration at the regional or global levels? Before we'll try to answer these questions together, we have an advantage to be introduced to this topic through the experience of our distinguished panelists, who I have pleasure now to welcome and introduce. As the first panelist, Hannah Cecilie Brandon, who is an advisor for the Norwegian National Human Rights Institution, will introduce us to the lessons learned by her team. How can procedural rights be effectively effectively protected by human rights legal framework? Norwegian National Human Rights Institution belongs definitely into the most active NHRIs in the European region. Then our second panelist, Jorge Fojaco, is a director and also specialist in environmental rights of Comisión Nacional de los Derechos Humanos of Mexico, who will share experience with the application of the Escazú Agreement. And the last panelist, Mr. Islador, representing Earth Justice to the UN in Geneva, will talk about experience with Aarhus Agreement from the perspective of civic organizations. In the meantime, I invite you to share your questions to the panelists in the chat box or Q&A box during the presentations. And now I'm happy to pass the floor to Hannah as the first panelist. Hannah, the floor is yours.
Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to this event. I'm very glad to be here to share some of our work on protection of procedural human rights under international human rights law. And as I'm sure you are all familiar with, these are the warming stripes showing the last warming in the 150 last years. And as you can see, the world is increasingly getting warmer. And together with GANRI, but also NRI, we have worked extensively with climate change and human rights. And today I wanted, as mentioned, to talk a bit about the procedural rights under human rights law. So if I could have the next slide. I wanted to show you also a report we have written on climate and human rights. And in our chapter 7, we focus on procedural rights. So procedural rights, as I'm sure you are aware, is not about the content of the decisions, but the requirements to the decision-making process. And this has a very heavy link with participatory democracy, because as we have already been talking about today, there cannot be no protection of the environment if there is no protection of the people defending the environment. So both freedom of expression and freedom of assembly is a prerequisite for democracy, but also for using the environmental procedural rights everyone has. And in this context, procedural rights includes participatory rights, so everyone can have a right to environmental information, public participation in decision-making, and also the right to effective legal remedies, so to challenge decision or decisions taken or lack of environmental information. And in addition to these rights, the procedural rights also encompass a duty to investigate for the government in relation to, for example, if there has been environmental disaster or climate disaster, you have to take steps to figure out what happened here, what part is attributable to climate change, and take action to make sure it doesn't repeat itself. So this is the chapter and the framework, and this is available online as well. But I wanted to, if you can have the next slide, please, talk to you a bit more about important legal sources setting out these rights as described. And one article which I think is relevant here is Article 12 of the Paris Agreement itself, because that right sets out that parties have an obligation to make information available to people and participation in the meetings, but also decision-making, education, and it kind of describes the procedural rights under the Paris Agreement. And of course, also the Aarhus Convention, which we have already covered, in the previous session, but also we will hear more about in the later session. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but just to note that this convention is a provides very strong sets of procedural rights, and we rely on this convention in our work because we see it's really important to make sure that environmental rights are protected. And in addition to these other conventions, procedural environmental rights are also implicit in other human rights. So this, I think, is an important element to be aware of as well, because even though there is no even though if your state is not party to convention, one of these conventions, or have adopted these kind of protections, other human rights may also encompass these procedural environmental rights. And that includes the right to life and private life, and also freedom of expression and the right to receive information. And coming from the Norwegian NHRI, I wanted to also discuss a bit more how this is done in the European context. So if I can have the next slide. Yes, so this is the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, and the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 8, the right to life, contains no explicit procedural requirements. So if you read the article, there's nothing mentioned along these lines. But as the European Court has frequently held in its case law, the decision-making process leading to a measure of interference or an environmental issue must be fair and afford due respect for the interest of the individual. So you see here that when interpreting this right, they have created this, this passage which must be respected. And this means that individuals must be able to participate in decision-making. An environmental impact assessment must often be carried out because this is important for the state to be able to evaluate in advance what the measures will be. And the public must be able to access studies and relevant information. And what I also think is worth noting is that the Aarhus Convention, which is also a standalone convention, also has on several occasions been relied on by the European Court to interpret the rights under European Convention. So this may also influence legally binding individual judgments, this Aarhus Convention. And of course, individuals have a right to an effective remedy in the European Convention. So this means access to justice. And in addition, I also mentioned previously that Article 2, the right to life, also includes some of the elements, and also Article 10, the freedom of expression. So after setting out this outline, which can sometimes seem a bit vague and what does it really mean, I wanted to go to the next slide, where I can show you an example of how these rights may be on the ground implemented. How does it work in practice? Because in a case called Greenpeace Nordic and others versus Norway, which is now before the European Court of Human Rights, one of the main issues in the case is whether the applicants have a right to receive information, and whether, and as I said before, whether the authorities have a duty to assess the combustion emissions from oil and gas before opening a new area for fossil fuel extraction. Because there is a difference between the emissions that originates on the territory of the states, which is about 5%, which are accounted for in Norway, but the remaining 95% are exported, which means that we sell it and they are burned on another state's territory. So whether the public has a right to receive information about these emissions and whether the state has a duty to assess them is an issue in this case. And together with our European network, ENRI, we have argued that there is such an obligation in the third-party intervention to the court. And this is also available online if any one of you want to read more. But if I can go to the next slide, I just wanted to illustrate the rationale behind this why we mean this. And here on the left, you can see that it is in Norwegian, but it shows the emissions under the line are the emissions that are at the moment assessed in impact assessments and shared with the public, but all the emissions over, which are by far the biggest, are not accounted for due to the system, international system. So we have argued that to efficiently protect individuals and give them sufficient information, the authorities must carry out sufficient studies which allow them to predict and evaluate in advance the effects of the activities which might damage individuals. So even though these emissions are exported, Norway is still in control over whether they will open this area to extraction, and again, whether these emissions will finally be burned. And the public has a right to access information, which allows them to assess the danger to which a decision may expose them to, and be able to challenge it judicially if they wish. So we have argued, in order for an evaluation to be sufficiently strong and clear, it must cover all effects of oil and gas extractions, which include combustion emissions. So now the next slide, where I can just thank you for your attention, and I hope that you can see both what kind of framework this is and maybe get some ideas to how it can be relevant for your work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I'm sure we can come back to your experience later on during Q&A session or part of our session. Now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Jorge.
Muchas gracias. Voy a compartir mi pantalla. Bien, agradezco a las instituciones organizadoras la oportunidad de participar en esta sesión. Reciban un afectuoso saludo de la maestra Rosario Piedra, presidenta de la Comisión Nacional de los Derechos Humanos en México. Sin mayor preámbulo, hago referencia al Acuerdo de Escazú, que es el acuerdo regional sobre el acceso a la información, a la participación pública y al acceso a la justicia en asuntos ambientales en América Latina y el Caribe. Este acuerdo se adoptó en el 4 de marzo de 2018 en Escazú, Costa Rica, con apoyo de la Comisión Económica para América Latina y el Caribe, la CEPAL, en su calidad de secretaría y la importante participación del público. El acuerdo entró en vigor el 22 de abril de 2021. Los antecedentes del acuerdo se remontan a la Conferencia de las Naciones Unidas sobre Desarrollo Sostenible, Río+20, del año 2012, con la declaración sobre la aplicación del principio 10 de la Declaración de Río sobre Medio Ambiente y el Desarrollo en América Latina. Por favor, la siguiente lámina. Para su redacción se tuvieron en cuenta los acuerdos internacionales y los acuerdos multilaterales sobre medio ambiente pertinentes, como la Convención de Aarhus de la Comisión Económica para Europa. El Comité de Negociación celebró un total de 9 reuniones presenciales y 6 virtuales en 3 sesiones. La siguiente lámina, por favor. El Acuerdo de Escazú es el primer tratado que los países de América Latina y el Caribe han celebrado en materia ambiental, el único derivado de la Conferencia de las Naciones Unidas sobre el Desarrollo Sostenible Río+20 y el único que contiene disposiciones específicas destinadas a proteger a las personas defensoras de derechos humanos en asuntos ambientales. El acuerdo se basa en el principio 10 de la Declaración de Río sobre Medio Ambiente y el Desarrollo. Tiene como finalidad garantizar la implementación plena y efectiva de los derechos de acceso a la información ambiental, a la participación pública en los procesos de toma de decisiones ambientales y el acceso a la justicia en asuntos ambientales, así como la creación y el fortalecimiento de capacidades, la cooperación para contribuir a la protección del derecho de cada persona, de las generaciones presentes y futuras, a vivir en un medio ambiente sano y el desarrollo sostenible. Está abierto a los 33 países de América Latina y el Caribe, estando sujeto a la ratificación, aceptación o aprobación de los estados que lo han firmado y abierto a la adhesión del resto de los países de la región. La siguiente lámina, por favor. The next slide, please. El acuerdo regional contiene un preámbulo, 26 artículos y un anexo. Puede desglosarse en 4 partes fundamentales. Una parte general que contiene el preámbulo, el objetivo, definiciones, principios y disposiciones generales. Una parte sustantiva que se refiere a los 4 pilares, que es el acceso a la información ambiental, la participación pública en los procesos de toma de decisiones ambientales, el acceso a la justicia en asuntos ambientales y defensores de los derechos humanos. Y un pilar transversal que tiene que ver con el fortalecimiento de capacidades y cooperación. Tiene también un apartado de disposiciones institucionales y otro de disposiciones finales y un anexo 1. Next slide, please. El artículo 3 se refiere a los 14 principios que guiarán a las partes en la aplicación del acuerdo. Estos principios son, entre otros, la igualdad, no discriminación, transparencia, rendición de cuentas, no regresión, progresividad, buena fe, principio preventivo, principio precautorio, equidad intergeneracional, máxima publicidad y principio pro persona. Next slide, please. En cuanto a la participación pública en la toma de decisiones ambientales, de acuerdo con el artículo 7, el público dispondrá de mecanismos para participar en el proceso de emisión de autorizaciones o permisos y revisiones de proyectos y actividades que tengan o puedan tener un impacto significativo en el medio ambiente. Se promoverá la participación pública, entre otros procesos de toma de decisiones, como planes, políticas, estrategias, normas y reglamentos. La participación tendrá lugar desde las etapas iniciales, de modo que se puedan tener debidamente en cuenta las observaciones del público. Asimismo, cada parte deberá proporcionar al público la información necesaria de forma clara, oportuna y comprensible y estipular plazos razonables. Además, las autoridades públicas realizarán esfuerzos por identificar al público directamente afectado por proyectos y actividades que tengan o puedan tener un impacto significativo sobre el medio ambiente y promoverán acciones específicas para facilitar la participación de personas y grupos que se encuentren en situación de vulnerabilidad. Además, en el artículo se contempla el artículo 12, el fomento de la participación del público en foros y negociaciones internacionales en materia ambiental o con incidencia ambiental. Next slide, please. En la parte de disposiciones institucionales, en el acuerdo se establece una conferencia de las partes en el artículo 15, que ya celebró su primera sesión en abril de este año. Se designa a la CEPAL como secretaría y se crea un comité de apoyo a la aplicación y el cumplimiento. En el artículo 14 se crea un fondo de contribuciones voluntarias para apoyar el financiamiento de la implementación del acuerdo. El comité de apoyo tendrá un carácter consultivo, transparente, no contencioso, no judicial y no punitivo para examinar el cumplimiento de las disposiciones del acuerdo y formular recomendaciones asegurando una participación significativa del público. Next slide, please. En el anexo 1 se enumeran los 33 países de América Latina y el Caribe a los que está abierto el acuerdo, de los cuales 24 ya lo han firmado y 13 ya son considerados parte, incluido México. Next slide, please. En materia de cambio climático, las obligaciones estatales contenidas en el artículo 7, apartado 12 del Acuerdo de Escazú, relativas a la participación del público en foros y negociaciones internacionales, debe leerse conjuntamente con los artículos 4, punto 1, inciso I, y 6, inciso A, fracción tercera de la Convención Marco de Naciones Unidas sobre Cambio Climático. El artículo 12 del Acuerdo de París, las decisiones de las conferencias de las partes, incluidas aquellas en las que se determinó que se llamaría Acción para el Empoderamiento Climático. Next slide, please. La educación, conjuntamente con la formación, la sensibilización, la participación, el acceso a la información y la cooperación internacional en la esfera del cambio climático, son los 6 elementos de la acción para el empoderamiento climático. Next slide, please. El programa de trabajo de Glasgow sobre la acción para el empoderamiento climático se integra por 4 apartados. En la parte que interesa es el cuarto apartado, correspondiente a la puesta en práctica de los 6 elementos que incluyen la participación. Yo agradezco mucho su atención y voy a quedar atento para ampliar las ideas, atender sus cuestionamientos, sus comentarios, así como para aclarar posibles dudas en el diálogo conjunto programado al finalizar la siguiente participación. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much for a detailed presentation information about Escazú Agreement. Now I would like to give the floor to Islador, who will talk more about Aarhus Convention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and I'm really very happy to be in this really very important discussion, because the role of national human rights institution is quite important in this matter. The Aarhus Convention has been mentioned already several times, and by Michel Frost, by Hannah Bryden, and by our speaker right now from the Escazú Convention. And indeed, we can consider the Aarhus Convention as being a parent convention to the Escazú. So I have here a number of slides, and I will go through some of them pretty quickly. I hope that this can be afterwards kept and shared, because they have been designed as being perhaps a resource that the National Human Rights Institution can use. Next slide. Thank you. So this is just a reminder about the very basic elements of the Aarhus Convention, that it was adopted in 1998. And I would add to this that right now it has 46 parties, which basically makes a region from Portugal to Kazakhstan. And basically now it's been operating since 20 years because it entered into force on the 30th of October 2001. Next slide. So very quickly, the main elements of this convention, and as it was very rightly said by Hannah, it is really focusing on the procedural aspect. It does not say what is the quality of the environment, or for example, how do you deal with climate change as such, but it deals how do people can act on the environment and what are the obligations of the states, of the parties to the convention in order to respect these very fundamental rights. So here you see the three pillars of the convention. Next slides, please. So the first pillar is the access to information. And the objective of the Article 4 is really to make sure that the access to information is open and is inclusive. All persons must have a capacity to ask for information. There is really there must be a broad interpretation of what is environmental information to prevent, restricting, and it is a challenge sometimes. And then all type of supports can be used for that. And of course, there must be also a time limit in the delivery. I mean, you cannot allow a request to stay and never be answered for months and so on. So there must be also very clear deadlines, and it should be as much as possible free of cost, or at least with a very reasonable charges. Next slide, please. So the second pillar is the pillar about public participation, and that's a very, of course, important one. Probably the one where there is the most challenges in the implementation of the convention. Now, Article 6, you have three articles which are covering this public participation. The first one is really that the participation here focuses with Article 6 on the permits, on when you have development of project on sites. And so you must conduct a correct environmental assessment. Of course, you can proceed also differently. As such, an EIA is not compulsory, but the process, which basically is like an EIA, is absolutely compulsory. And you have a number in the annex, and this is very much like the Escazú Convention. You have an annex where all the activities which are concerned are listed. Next slide. So what is very, very important here, and that makes a difference with, for example, the general provisions, human rights provisions in this field, as they were presented by Hannah before, is here you have specific obligations for the parties to the convention to make sure that the public concerned by a project receives the information. And it cannot be just a passive obligation where you put it on a website somewhere and people can access to it. You have an obligation as a state to make sure that all of the people who will be affected, which is called in the convention the public concerned, receives the information in a timely way and in a way that it can understand it. You cannot just say, oh, we have on a website a very, very thick dossier with all of the elements, you can just go through it. No, that is not possible. It has to be understandable by the people who will be looking at that. And there has been a number of examples where parties were not considered as being in conformity with the convention, because they did not do all the outreach, for example, to minorities, to vulnerable populations who usually are not very much involved with institutions. You must make sure that these people have the information and they are able to participate. Next slide, please. And then in terms of public participation, when we go further than just specific projects or sites, which will be where you will have a specific development, there are still some obligations when you develop plans and policies. Again, there must be a participation in the preparation of these plans and policies. And again, you have the same obligation that it must be timely, that there must be clear requests in the way you manage this, and that in the way you deal with it, you do take into consideration all of the information that you had. You are not in compliance with the convention if you listen, make your decisions, but don't say why you did not follow or why you followed some of the elements. And that is a way to check whether the convention has been applied correctly. It is to see how in the decision there is an argument about all of the elements that came up during the public participation. So it does not mean that you have an obligation to follow the advice which has, or the opinions which have been expressed, but then you have to say, how do you deal with them? Why you didn't follow them? So you have to take them into consideration. Do you have a due account obligation? Next slide, please. And this applies also because in some situations, of course, each country has its own organization. It applies also when you have legislative activities who are like giving out permits, and that happens in some countries. The parliaments can provide a permit. Then you must apply the provisions of the convention exactly like the other way. So next slide, please. So this brings us to the last third pillar of the Aarhus Convention, which is access to justice. And here the element of access to justice really focuses on the two previous pillars. You must have a recourse in case the convention is not correctly applied or these provisions are not correctly applied. You must have a capacity to go to justice. Next slide. And of course, there is also the fact that there must be also a right of standing in environmental matters. And this is an issue which is broader than sometimes just the two pillars, to make sure that in environmental matters, there is a general access to justice. So these are really the main elements of the convention that it comes, and basically the convention is structured very much like the presentation we just had about the Escazú Convention. As I said, they are really parent convention. You can see that because the structure is very similar to that. Next slide, please. So next slide. So I'd like now to really give perhaps a particular focus for the NHRIs who are within the area of the Aarhus Convention, who are in parties to this convention. Next slide. And what is really important is the work of the compliance committee, because there is an important mechanisms like the one that was presented with the Escazú Convention. And what is interesting with the compliance committee is that actually it's a very defined, strict procedure with strict deadlines and so on. And actually, it is the reason why another mandate has been created on defenders. It's because for defenders, as Michel Frost has said just previously, you need specific action, quick action, you need also preventive actions. When the compliance committee has a very strict rule on admitting the cases, going through the information gathering, holding hearings with the concerned party and the communicants, and then going further. So you have this in this mechanism. Right now, you have 194 cases which have been brought to the committee. And so a number of them are actually coming from the public. That's really the main elements. You have those coming from parties and from secretariats. Next slide, please. And so, well, we can go also to the next slide. And so you can see who in the public is providing these type of information to the compliance committee. Next slide, please. And here you see, as I said before, that the issues of public participation is usually the one that is the most challenged and where you have the most difficulties. And then, of course, second comes the question of access to justice. Next slide, please. So here is just to show the importance of the compliance committee, because the compliance committee, for example, here in this case, has changed some of the EU procedures inside the European Union. So it is not just a body, of course, linked to soft law, but some call it not that soft, because it has made very, very substantial changes in the parties to the Aarhus Convention. Next slide, please. Now, I wanted to show, next slide, please, that now the Aarhus Convention has become universal in a way. It's the very first step to stepping out of the region of the UNECE, because Guinea-Bissau is in the process of becoming a member of the Aarhus Convention. It has been approved by the last meeting of the parties of the convention. And so there were also discussions, and I was really very interested by the presentation by the National Commission of Mongolia, because we had, and I had the privilege to participate to some of them, discussions with the Mongolian authorities about having a participation to the Aarhus Convention. So this would be a very, very important participation into the convention. Next slide, please. I just wanted, next slide, thank you. I just wanted also to mention that today there is also a development about how do you deal with private actors, and that's something which has to be followed very, very clearly, because it is an issue which is coming also in the discussions within the implementation of the Aarhus Committee. And now, next slide, please. It is also very important to see that both communities, the one in the Aarhus Convention and the Escazú Convention, are both working together within the COPs. Here you have, I should have copied also Article 7, which was presented before, which are the basis on which parties who have ratified these two conventions have obligation to promote these elements in international fora. So there are meetings now at the COPs since several years where the two communities come together at the beginning of the COPs in order to see what are the human rights challenges which are discussed, and some of the elements like Article 6 or the access to action for climate empowerment, which were mentioned before, are elements where precisely these two communities can come together. And I would definitely encourage the national human rights institutions all together, I mean, from these two communities, but others also, to join these type of discussions where you see the civil society, where you see also the different parties coming together in order to develop a strategy within the COPs in order to see how the links with the human rights and climate change can be strengthened in the work within the climate change negotiation. Final and next slide. And here I have provided, and again, I hope this will be shared, can be shared afterwards for those who would like to have it, a number of resource material you can have access to have some specific elements in. Thank you very much for your attention. Next, this is the final slide, and I remain open for any questions, and I look forward for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for very, very rich presentation. I would like to just confirm that we will share with participants all the presentations and materials which were submitted by the panelists. So you will get access to them. I would like to now open our interactive discussion part. I can see that we already have one question from the floor, so I'll just read it aloud. Thank you for the interesting presentation on the Escazú Agreement. Could you tell us more about the implication and role of the National Human Rights Commission of Mexico in that regard?
Bien, el acuerdo de Escazú es reciente. No obstante, el texto del mismo se conocía de años atrás. Y cuando todavía no se firmaba, se hacían llamados reiterados a la firma del acuerdo y después, una vez firmado, a la ratificación del mismo. En materia de reparación del daño sobre contaminación, consta la recomendación 134/2022 sobre la contaminación del río Santiago, en donde se utiliza el acuerdo de Escazú como un instrumento vinculante y se establece la vulneración a los derechos humanos, a la información, a la participación, y se proponen medidas de reparación del daño en estos derechos en particular. En la recomendación 38/2018, que podría ser la más próxima al tema de cambio climático, se pidió también como medida de reparación la participación significativa de las personas afectadas que perdieron su vivienda por las tormentas Ingrid y Manuel, es decir, en el tema de medidas de adaptación al cambio climático, a que participaran de manera significativa en la reconstrucción de viviendas para reparar ese daño. Muchas gracias.
Thank you for the response to the question. I would probably expand a bit the question to all our panelists. Can we maybe focus and give more examples of how these agreements focus, define and protect various aspects of participation? They also define what does it mean when we speak about meaningful participation. How these can be used in maybe even preventive and advocacy work of NHRIs or CSOs on national level? Who would like to take the floor? Yes.
Yes, well, thank you very much. The provisions of the Aarhus Convention are very clear on how do you proceed. So really it is to prevent to have token participation or fake participation. For example, the question of the access to information is extremely important because otherwise you don't have clear participation. You do not know what you're talking about. So that must be avoided. And of course, you must really have an information that provides all of the elements of the projects on which you have to participate. You must have correct timing. And again, as I said, I really underline that the obligation of the parties is an active, and that's where you have a change in the classical human rights approach, because you have an obligation to provide information you have. But here it goes further for environmental information. You have to make sure that in a project, all of the concerns communities have it, understand it, and can react on it. So it is really a very important element. And you have a number in front of the compliance committee of cases which came where people did not consider, for example, the way the project was delimitated. They said, but I am affected, when the countries, oh no, you're not. So you're not, we don't have the same obligations towards you. And you have a number of these elements which are very practical, very concrete, where we make sure that the people are in the process. And then at the end, you can check that by checking in the decision how the opinions were considered or taken on board, which doesn't mean they have to be followed. We have to be very clear on that. It's different from, making a decision or participating in the decision making. And these elements are very important. But then the question of how do you consider what has been said must be reflected in your final decision.
I can just add to that very interesting contribution. I just wanted to say that some of the issues we have worked with Norway with relation to the Aarhus Convention is exactly, for example, you need to have timelines that allows the information to be shared at a stage where you can still influence the decision. So that's a very important part, as Yves has said, because for example, if the information comes when the decision is already taken or at a very late stage, there's no real participation. So I think, as Yves underlined really well, is that the Aarhus Convention is quite useful in the way that it's so clear what must be done. So that has been very important for our work. And another element, which may be of also relevance to others, is that the access to justice part also prohibits excessively expensive cases. I think that's the formulation. So it also has a side to the access to justice must also be not too expensive. So that's also an issue that can be important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for the contributions. Now I would like to take the liberty to go back to our lead questions for the session to maybe just to summarize. And also I would like to invite participants to contribute with their ideas for these three questions. So first of all, what would you identify as the most important barrier or challenge you think we should focus on in regards of meaningful participation? Whoever wants to take the floor from our panelists. Is it too abstract?
I can try again, but I would go exactly in the line of what Hannah has said, and that was also included in Jorge's presentation. It's very important that you don't do the token participation by basically consulting people on a project which is already in a way decided. And we see that in a number of countries where immediately then you have a demonstration against participation, precisely because people think that they have not been taken into consideration seriously. In our jargon, we talk about 0.0, which is a bit like of a buzzword, but the idea is all options must be opened. Otherwise, it is not real participation. I mean, it's cosmetic participation. And I think this is a bit of the problem. And I would say that today, especially when we're talking about climate change, one of the difficulty we have is that because of the urgency, because we didn't act early enough, we're getting now into serious difficulties. And we see very well how a number of countries all around the world, including our parties, are now even making new laws where they will cut through the participatory process in order to make sure that you immediately have new energy projects. And that is extremely dangerous because basically we're getting into these incredible contradictions where we're sacrificing nature in order to save the environment. I mean, this is just nonsense. And we do see projects which can affect, for example, bird migration corridors. Well, no, you can't complain about that anymore. This is finished. We just wanted to have it right now. Well, then you're going to have a huge impact on ecosystems, not only in your own country, but also where the birds are migrating to. So, I mean, these are really elements. And then you have transboundary problems because you created it by putting it in the wrong place. So if you don't have these elements, you really have a huge problem. And then you also have another element, which is about the private sector. There is often the argument that, oh, but that's a bit complicated for the private sector. It is true that it is a process you have to go through, so you cannot just jump on a site and create something. On the other hand, it's absolutely crucial if we want to talk about sustainable development. And it's also needed for international cooperation to have a level playing field. And it's very interesting to see, for example, how some states are starting to see the need to have real due diligence process. And that must be also at the international level. So conventions like the ARUS and the Escazú Convention are really helping in order to have a legal basis in order to develop to have a real sustainable development.
Mm-hmm. And if I expand the first question about barriers to specifically question of participation at really high level climate talks like conference like COP27, for example, what are the greatest barriers? Or I will change a bit the question. Can now civic society effectively and meaningfully participate at the global level?
I think that, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, go. Bueno, en el acuerdo de Escazú, como veíamos, se establece esa obligación de participación a ese nivel. En realidad, la experiencia hasta ahora queda muy corta, pero progresivamente se debe de ir cumpliendo y perfeccionando, ligando con la pregunta anterior, pues uno de los retos de la participación significativa es que algunas autoridades no están tan familiarizadas con niveles de participación intensa y enfrentan dificultades por lo que puede ser lo complejo de la actividad. Entonces, tanto las autoridades de las cancillerías como a quienes están relacionados con la aprobación de obras y proyectos deben de reforzar la información y la participación.
Thank you very much. Hannah, you wanted to respond as well, and then Yves also wanted to share thoughts.
I actually wanted to ask Yves also about if he could explain more about the work they have done or how the meetings he described in his presentation on ensuring that the ORIS and ESCAGO principles are implemented at the talks.
Yeah, thank you. Well, they have been already included. I mean, within the agenda, you have what has been mentioned before, the Action for Climate Empowerment, which directly derives from the Paris Agreement. Then there has been also discussions in having human rights safeguards in, for example, all of the financial mechanisms, which means that people must have a capacity to act on what is being decided and so on. So we're exactly at the heart of the matter. Now, to be also precise, there is an RSS community at the COPs. There are meetings that happen at the very beginning where you have these discussions among states, NGOs, and so on, indigenous peoples' representations. We have in Geneva also what is called the Geneva Pledge, which is led by Costa Rica and Germany, which is also, and they are right now working on a paper they are sending to the COP 27. So it's a number of countries who are making this link between human rights and climate change issues at the COP. And then you have what is called the NGO Working Group on Human Rights and Climate Change, which is very often in contact with all of these different parties, and definitely having more contact with the national human rights institutions would be very, very useful. And I remain at the disposal of the Secretariat if there's any facilitation we can do, so that next week, for example, if some national human rights institutions are in Sharm el-Sheikh, we can make the links and facilitate the different contacts. We would definitely welcome more human rights institutions' participation in these discussions in the COPs and in the preparation process of the COPs. We really would like to have that. And I would say that this is really, because we've been really focusing on ESCAGO and ORIS because they are strong, legally binding instruments. But of course, we also have, for all of those who are not in these areas, you have also the Bali guidelines from UNEP, which basically is a process developed under UNEP in order to see how we implement Principle 10, which is, as Jorge has said very clearly, is the basis on which these different instruments have been developed. So we have a number of we could call even perhaps the ORIS, ESCAGO, and Bali community that could be active in the COPs. I don't know if I answered your question, Anna.
Thank you very much for all your inputs and really a nice dynamic discussion. I'm really sorry that I have to cut it just now before we were able to go to the second and third question. I will just shortly mention our open letter, Ganri open letter, which will be published shortly on our website and maybe also shared in a chat box, which might be also used as a tool for NHRIs to step in a discussion on the national level and clearly show to the ministries and other authorities that there are other stakeholders who would like to focus also on human rights aspects of the climate change policies. Thank you very much for your presentations, for really nice discussion afterwards. And now I would like to pass the floor to the representative of UNEP. For the closing remarks.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Chairperson, national human rights institutions, UN partners, friends and colleagues. It gives me a real pleasure to deliver the closing remarks for this wonderful symposium hosted by the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions in collaboration with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the United Nations Development Programme. In closing, I would like to first spend a few moments looking back, because I believe it's fair to say that we have come a long way. In 2018, NHRIs adopted the Marrakesh Declaration on Promoting and Protecting Human Rights Defenders. Building on this, in 2020, the annual conference of GANRI adopted an outcome document on climate change, which contains commitments of NHRIs to ramp up a rights-based approach to climate actions. The outcome document also requested OHCHR, UNDP, and UNEP to support the efforts of NHRIs. Since then, we have collaborated, that is GANRI, OHCHR, UNDP, and UNEP, to come together and support the establishment of a caucus of NHRIs on climate change. We published a toolkit for NHRIs to assist monitoring and reporting on human rights implications of climate change and other environmental issues. We've also organized related meetings at the Conference of the Parties and capacity building webinars together. One of the highlights of our collaboration is without a doubt the adoption of historic resolutions of the Human Rights Council, but also very recently the General Assembly that recognized the human right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment in 2021 and 2022 respectively. And just last month, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution on NHRIs, which was dedicated to climate change. Resolution 51/31 welcomes our collaboration and encourages enhanced actions of NHRIs addressing climate issues. So it's been a long journey, and this was only possible because we all played a role, and in particular, each and every NHRI that are really on the front line to defend environmental defenders and to protect human rights from climate and environmental degradation on the ground. What then is next? While we've achieved tangible outcomes together in the past and laid out a solid groundwork for the work on human rights, climate change, and the environment, now is really the time for accelerated implementation. It is time that we make the right to a clean and healthy environment a reality for everyone. We urgently need in this context a country-level implementation of the promotion and protection of the right, especially for those that are disproportionately affected by climate and environmental degradation, including environmental defenders, children, indigenous peoples, and women. NHRIs have, and this has been discussed throughout this symposium, have a critical role to play and are already implementing the right as we have learned. You are an independent voice advocating for human rights, environmental defenders, climate justice, and international and intergenerational equity. You are agents of change. But I also acknowledge that UNEP has a role to play. For example, in 2018, UNEP adopted an internal policy on promoting greater protection for environmental defenders. The policy has guided UNEP in directly supporting over 100 environmental defenders across the world in exercising their human rights to a healthy environment. UNEP is working on a guideline for protection of environmental defenders for UN country teams, together with OHCHR and UNDP. We have organized defenders fora, and we are due to publish a toolkit for environmental defenders. But to facilitate the implementation of the right to a clean and healthy environment further, I just want to give you a few examples what we are working on at the moment together with OHCHR and UNDP. For example, a common narrative on the right to a healthy environment for the UN to promote coordinated action by the UN on the ground, and a joint publication on the right to a healthy environment, which is designed to help the implementation of the right. A recently published UNEP report, the Emissions Gap Report 2022, indicates that the international community is falling far short of the Paris Agreement goals, with no credible pathway to 1.5 degrees in place. The report calls for transformative change in our societies, and we believe the implementation of the right to a clean and healthy environment is such a transformative change if implemented. So UNEP firmly believes that NHRIs are one of the key actors that can make this transformative change for people and the planet. We in UNEP, we are firmly committed to continue supporting the work of NHRIs in implementing a rights-based approach to climate and environmental actions. And we look forward to continuing the collaboration with all of you in making the right to a clean and healthy environment a reality for all. I thank you very much.